Today on the Pitchbook podcast, Zach is pitching Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order by Ray Dalio. And I'm pitching When Bride Still Mattered by David Moranis. Batter up! Zach, you had a question from a listener, and we get these so often. We finally decided to answer one. So tell us the question, and then we can talk about
it. The question was, how do you, number one, how do you find the books that you are reading? Like, how do you distill down to the books that get in front of you that you read? That was number one. And then number two is, are you listening to books? Do you read books? How many books a month do you read? And so it really got me thinking. I don't know that I really plan things this way, but I do enjoy reading, and I think you have to enjoy what you're reading, the content that you're interested in. First, a lot of people, it's nonfiction, which we don't really cover nonfiction.
No, we cover nonfiction.
Or I'm sorry, fiction.
Yeah. A lot of people like fiction. We cover nonfiction mostly, for sure.
That's right.
Okay.
Sorry. A lot of people like to read fiction, and occasionally I'll read a book on fiction if it's highly recommended or it's one of the classics that maybe I haven't read, but mostly nonfiction, biographies and things about finance and discoveries and technology. Those things are, I love reading really about anything. I probably wouldn't be too interested in a book on gardening. That doesn't really get me going. But I started thinking through it, and I'll just kind of share what works for me is I'll read 2 physical books a month on average. And I've found the average book is about 400 pages. Some are less, some are much longer. Like biographies, sometimes those are 600-700 pages. So those take a while to plow through. And sometimes I'll read a short book that's maybe 100 pages or 150 pages that distills down some principles, which I like. So I'll normally read a couple physical books, and then I'll usually have a credit every month through Amazon Prime that I have a book on audio. Like I just downloaded a book yesterday, which I'm going to pitch later. I'll probably get the physical copy of the book and I'll just listen to it. But when I download it, sometimes it's a little disappointing because you look at the time, and this one that I just downloaded was 6 hours. So I'm like, that's going to last me a few days. That's not going to get me through the month. So I may need to pick something else up just to listen while I'm driving, while I'm working. There's a lot of idle time, and that's time that I could be learning, but I also find it valuable to sometimes not listen to anything. I'll just drive and think about life. So here's the math. I'm currently 44 years old. And if I live to 90, that means I have 46 years left to read. And let's just assume that I maintain all of my cognitive abilities to 90. My grandfather lived to 90. Well, one lived to 90, the other one 76. So maybe I have less time. Maybe I should take an average of those two, but let's just say it's 90. And if I read 3 books a month, that's 36 books a year. So 46 times 36, that's 1,656 books I have left from now until when I kick the bucket. So I look at that and I think, I don't know how many thousands of books, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of books there are to even read. But those 1,656 books have to be pretty important in my mind.
Yeah.
To take the time to read. So during the month, what I try to do is read 30 pages a day. If you're reading 400 pages, let's just say one book divided by an average of 30 days a year, that's 13 pages per day to read just one book. Now, if you're listening to a book, that's easy because you can do that. A lot of people have idle time doing things in the yard. It's summertime and you're out pulling weeds and you just listen to a book.
Well, and I put it on like 1.5, 1.7 speed.
Oh, do you?
Oh, for sure.
Oh, see, I can't.
I love it.
Okay. I'll have to try it.
Once you get used to it, you can never go back. They sound like they're talking so slow. So
Yeah.
I would
Okay.
recommend it.
Okay.
If not, at least do 1.25.
Maybe I'll do that with this book.
Unless it's a pretty dense book, sometimes I'll have to slow down. Sometimes I will go back and slow it down, uh, just because they said something pretty meaty that I wanted to rehear. But yeah, so just for the record, I pretty much read, or sorry, read. I don't read anything. I just listen. But if there's a book that I liked a lot of the quotes or some of the things I want to remember, I sometimes will go back and buy that book just so I can look back and not have to try and find it listening. I could just flip through the pages and find what I liked. So,
Okay. That's interesting because I've find that if I'm out working, doing things, if I'm focused on the task that I'm working on, my brain will stop listening. So I'll have to pause. So I try to listen it slowly, but maybe this book, once I finish it, I'll do it at 1.5 times or 2 times and see if I
2 times might be a bit much,
I'll
but
read it
yeah.
2 times this month. All right.
Anyway,
So
I interrupted you, so go ahead. Back to
no,
what you were
no,
saying.
I'll just I'm just going to keep going through the math here. So one book, 400 pages on average. If you read 13 pages a day,
I thought you said 30 before.
I read 30.
Oh, if somebody reads 13. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So if you read just 13 pages a day over 30 days, you'll read one book a month, which I
Okay.
think is fantastic.
Right.
On the whole, I'm not even sure what the average American reads per year in terms of books, but one a month seems really doable. So if you double that, you say, okay, I'll listen to one book, and then I think I can read 30 pages a day. It takes about 50 minutes to read 30 pages, and I'm not a fast reader. I try to digest and really focus. So I'll find a quiet room at night after the kids have gone to bed, everyone's winding down. We're all like, porting off to our different rooms and locations. I'll just find a quiet place and sit down and read. So I'm not a fast reader, but on average, it takes about 50 pages. Now, how much time does the average American spend on social media per day? What would you guess? Like
Oh man.
just scrolling. And I thought it would be a higher number than what it is, but what would you
Is
guess it
it not
is?
like 2 hours or something?
Wow,
I'm gonna guess 2 hours.
you're dead on. Two
Okay.
hours and 23 minutes is
Okay.
research from GWI is 2 hours and 23 minutes of
Hmm.
scrolling. Or I didn't look up watching TV or watching the news.
TV is quite a bit, right?
It's got to be high. And
Yeah.
I don't really watch. We don't have cable in my house. We got rid of cable years and years ago. And that just unlocks so much time. The, personally. But I do spend time on social media. I think everybody does to some extent. So, anyways, that's the math. That's what I do. So 30 pages a day gets you to 2 books a month. Listening to one book, that's my diet. And Naval Ravikant, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his name. He made a comment that listening to a book is like drinking your vegetables.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
I
I
don't
love
know.
it. I
Okay,
love it. That's how
explain
I
that
get my
to me.
vegetables. Well,
Explain that to me. Like, what does that mean? It's just easier to get
well,
it
it's
in your
easy.
system versus eating is
I think it's
torture.
easier, and it's also like probably not as nutritionally complete is what I think of what he's saying. I think he's taking a stab at taking a dig
At
at
listening.
listening. Yeah,
Like it's
that's what
better
I
to
take.
read. Okay. I didn't know how to take that. Like maybe you can just get more vegetables in one gulp and move on
That's
with your day.
honestly, if I couldn't listen to books, this podcast wouldn't exist because I just wouldn't read enough.
Yeah.
Um, and I definitely like to listen while I'm, I don't know, doing the dishes or, sweeping up the house or whatever it is. Or when I'm just going to bed or whatever. That way I can just, especially at 1.7 speed, it's good for me. So what's funny though, I've noticed, since we started, I used to listen to quite a few podcasts. And it's funny, since we started this podcast, my podcast consumption has gone way down and
Yeah.
my audiobook consumption has gone way up. Um, so anyway,
Interesting.
yeah, it's
I
been,
would say the podcast quality for me has gone up because
oh,
to your point, I've really narrowed down kind of what I'm consuming there
yeah.
and have increased reading. And wouldn't that be a great problem to have in the world?
Yeah. Yeah. I just don't make the time, I guess. I'd rather just listen to a good
A
book.
book.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
Eh,
There you go. There you have it.
Yeah. And on the and one thing I would recommend is the Libby app for those that have a library card. Go get a library card and hop on the Libby app, because then you can get a bunch of books for free that are audio books. You can get like the Kindle version as well of regular books. Um, but that we have both the Audible, like 2 credits a month, and then also Libby. So that's where I get quite a few of my books, is on Libby. So anyway,
Nice.
okay. So tell me about principles for dealing with the unchanging world, or sorry, the changing world order.
The changing world order.
Yeah, sorry. Yes. Tell me
Okay.
about that. How did
What
you
do,
find
what
this? How did you find
okay.
this?
So Ray Dalio is, if you're not familiar with who he is in the investment world, he's like, everybody knows who he is. He's like a very well-known hedge fund manager. He is a what's called a global macro investor. So he's somebody who thinks a lot about what's going on in the world, what's the direction the world is going, and then placing bets on those things. And he's been very successful. He manages his hedge fund company, Bridgewater Asset Management, I think is the name of it.
Mhm.
Manages billions of institutional assets. So he's very well known, but he is a student of history. And most successful investors they do study history. He wrote a book called Principles. I'll have to look it up. I'm trying to remember. It's like Principles for Your Life. Um, I know that's not the name of it. I'll go search it up. But he wrote this book called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, and then he also Principles for Dealing with a Debt Crisis.
Hmm.
So, in full disclosure, I've not read the other two books. This one sounded very interesting. I read it during 2020, during the pandemic, um, along with The Fourth Turning. I thought this dovetails really nice into that book. So this book, I will give you just a very brief summary. If you like learning about how nation states emerge and become successful, often we talk about companies becoming successful, but how did the United States
Hmm.
become the uh, like the a global dominant power and kind of unseat Britain? And how did Britain or England unseat the Dutch or the Netherlands
Mhm.
as the world reserve currency? So this book goes through about 500 years of history, starting in 1500, and he spans the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, Ottoman Empire, but focuses on the big four empires: the Dutch, the British, US currently, and the Chinese empires.
Hmm.
So he goes through and talks about these cycles. And he said in the 1971, when President Nixon took the US off of the gold standard. So back then we were fighting the Vietnam War. And at that time, there was a gold was the reserve currency. So gold, the dollar was pegged 30, I think it was $35 for an ounce of gold, and it was pegged. So you couldn't have more dollars unless you had more gold. You had to go dig it up out of the ground. But when you're in a war and you're just spending, building planes, bombs, tanks, military, you have to have dollars. And gold is not something easy to extract from the ground.
Right.
And coincidentally, a lot of other nations had deposited gold to the US because it was kind of safe post World War II. It's like, let's send our gold to the United States. So we have a lot of other countries' gold deposited at the Federal Reserve. So Nixon takes us off. I believe it was August 15th, 1971. Ray Dalio seeing this on the news, and he thought, that's not good. If you unpeg the dollar from gold and you just start printing dollars, everything's going to fall apart. So he goes
Yep.
in the next morning to work, getting ready to like start trading, getting ready for the mayhem.
Mhm.
But what happens is the stock market rallied. Everything starts going up. And he's like, what is going on? Like, why is this happening? And so he started to study what happens when countries debase their currency. And when I say debase their currency, I'm meaning they're printing more dollars, the currency becomes devalued. We have experienced this here recently. When you look at real estate in the United States, real estate prices have gone up, or have they? Has your house really changed at all?
The
You know,
inflation has also gone up with the price.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So the price of goods has gone up, but really it just takes more dollars to buy those same things. And so we call that the debasement of a currency. So he studies this over time, and why things were going up the next day is people were buying assets. They're like, I'm going to swap out my dollars that are surely going to be debased, and I'm going to buy other stuff that's harder to make. So we kind of see these asset bubbles in a world order. So the American world order came after he talks about these long arcs of time. So there are world orders, and then there's internal orders or changes. So an example in the United States was the American Revolution, was kind of an internal revolution, and it's still operating today. Russia had a new order from 1971 or 1917, excuse me, was replaced in 1991. And in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party won its civil war. So within countries, there's these little um, changes that happen, these little internal conflicts, but then these orders also change on a global scale. So post World War II, after the Allies won World War II, there was the 1944 Bretton Woods Treaty, which established the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And since then, we've been operating as the global reserve currency. So if you're in the United States, that's pretty sweet because everybody trades in the dollar. You have what they call seniorage, meaning you can print more dollars, kind of get away with it.
Hmm.
Um, it's not good, right, long term. But
Right.
people wonder, like, how can we keep creating the debt that we have and not have everything just come apart? And that's because we can print dollars and buy the debt, but over time, your currency gets weaker and the nation gets weaker. So in this book, he goes through several examples: the Dutch, the British, now the US, and he talks about these cycles. And I won't go into great depth in these cycles, but I do want to touch on a couple of these. So the cycle starts, if we want to think about like an empire's life cycle. Generally, they start with strong leadership. They have inventiveness, strong education, a strong culture, good resource allocation, strong competitiveness, strong income growth, strong markets. So that's how these nations kind of start. Everyone's disciplined, working together on the same page. There's not any internal fighting. Like everyone is working towards the same goals. And over time, that kind of degrades. People become wealthy. They start being less productive. There's a lot of decadence. This is kind of at the top of the cycle, and it becomes expensive to trade with these nations. So, as an example, we have stopped manufacturing things in the US. It's cheaper to make them in other countries. So we start just sending our dollars, our money to these other nations that are like, thank you very much. And they're like trying to ascend. We become overextended, create more debt. And a lot of these things sound kind of familiar. There's a rising wealth gap within the country. So that's kind of the top of the period, and then there's a decline where the nation starts to go into large debts. There's becomes a lot of printing money because that's the solution rather than increasing taxes. They just debase the currency, which is also creates inflation, and that's a tax. There's a lot of internal conflict, and eventually there's a loss of the world's reserve currency. And this happened with the Dutch, with the English, and Ray Dalio, in the book, he talks about the U.S. is kind of on this decline, and it only resolves through Strong leadership, it can resolve that way. You can extend the life of the empire or through some kind of civil war or revolution. Any questions so far?
Does he spend as much time on the Dutch and English as the Americans and Chinese?
He does.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is
Yeah.
quite
So I'm going to
detailed.
jump into the Dutch here.
Yeah.
Okay. Because you think, is there really that much history? And the answer is there's a ton of history. There's a lot of records from the last 500 years.
Yeah, and I was just in the Netherlands, and it was interesting because a lot of painters. We went to a museum there. We talked about it the other day, but a lot of the pictures in the museum were of merchants because that's who had money to pay for the paintings. Whereas in like Italy, it was all the religious leaders that had the money to pay for paintings, in the Renaissance. So
Interesting.
yes, I know the Dutch traded very well and ruled the seas for quite a while.
Okay. So let's talk about the Dutch. You were just there
Hmm.
and you just hit perfectly on kind of where I'm going.
Hmm.
So the Dutch rise, they defeat the Habsburg Empire. It's around the early 1600s. They had an excellent education. Now, here are some of the inventions. I think at the time they produced something like 25% of the world's invention. By the way, there's a really good 45-minute video that Ray Dalio does. If you just search up Google Ray Dalio, the principles for changing world order, there's a YouTube video that he did. So good and worth watching. It was excellent summary and it kind of summarizes the book. But if you like the more deep getting in the detail, I
Hmm.
highly recommend just buying the book and reading it. I had a
Gotcha.
lot underlined as I read it. All right, so here are some of the inventions that the Dutch, after they kind of rise to power. So you've got strong leadership, everyone working together, strong family dynamics, strong education, strong culture. We have the telescope, 1624, the pendulum clock, 1654, the windmill, 1670, the Dutch flute. Is that how you pronounce it? That's the new Dutch ship.
Oh, yeah, I don't
So
have no idea.
okay, Fluyt. I
Sure,
might be mispronouncing that, but we know that the Dutch were very good at shipbuilding.
for sure.
Okay, they invented capitalism to finance voyages. They're like, we have these ships. How do we finance this?
Hmm.
And in 1602, you had the Dutch East India Company, which is a totally different story about trading stocks. That kind of all blew up. But it did create this idea that instead of having the government fund things, people can fund it with their own personal wealth. And people wanted to. So they bought shares of this Dutch East India Company, which financed all of these different voyages around the world. And in 1612, they had created the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. So they created this finance center. Later, England had a finance center in London. Today, in the United States, it's New York, and China has their own financial centers. So that is very apparent in these different empires over time.
Hmm.
Okay, now what happened with the Dutch? They became very wealthy. They were the world reserve currency with the Dutch guilder. Nobody could, before this podcast, I would be surprised if anyone was thinking about the Dutch guilder this morning. It's not the world reserve currency anymore. When you
No,
went to the Netherlands, what currency did you use?
the euro, but the guilder I only remember because we did Anne Frank recently, right?
All right.
I
That's
remember
right.
her talking about that a little bit. So,
Okay. So over time, the decadence sets in, and uh, the English were kind of in the ascension. And they said, you know what? We can build these ships cheaper than what the Dutch can, but we can hire a Dutch architect to design the ship and we'll build them in England.
hmm.
And so you start to have this trading dynamic where you get the technology from the company, from the country. This is going to sound really familiar to kind of what's happening today. You
Yep.
take that technology, you import it, you've got the access to cheap labor markets. So you start building the ships, and then pretty soon it's like all of that uh, advantage that the Dutch had goes away,
Yeah.
and England starts to become the powerhouse. The other thing, the Dutch had become overextended financially. You have to protect your trade routes. You have to protect your dominance in the world and setting up your own little empire on different nations and countries, and that's not cheap to do. So you're paying for that. You're losing your technological advantage to other countries.
Hmm.
And England goes through this same cycle, right? They have like the British Empire, and they do the exact same thing. And in the US, what do? We have to protect our trade routes. I mean, there's all kinds of stories about, our own ships and fleets being taken hostage, these shipping lanes that are very vulnerable with these cheap drones that are trying to take out some of our shipping um, cargo ships. Anyways, it's so interesting because it just keeps repeating over and over again. So when you read this book, you're like, these things in our world today, they seem new to me, but they're not really new at all.
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
just have happened time and time again. So I'll kind of wrap. So eventually, the British take over. The British pound becomes the world reserve currency, all the way up until post World War II, and the U.S. with the Allies comes in, good financial strength position. But now you can see like our debt is accelerating. We're not all kind of moving together as a nation. We're not on the same page. And it's a bit concerning. And in the book, he does talk about that. His thought is, and what's interesting is capitalism is the mode for the nation to become wealthy. And he's like, even though China is a communist country, they have used capitalism to create wealth, which is interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
the government's communist, but the vehicle to build wealth has been a very much capitalistic. There's no doubt about it. But they
Yeah.
have put a very tight lid on everything. So there are a few contributors to a strong empire, and I'll just kind of close out here. If you have any other questions, it'd be awesome to go through that. So these are the contributors to a strong empire. You need a strong education base,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the family, the schools. That has to be a pillar within the society, how
Mm-hmm.
education is being uh, introduced. Technology, I think the U.S. is pretty good there. We're still inventing things, um, although that technology is being used across the world.
Yep.
Competitiveness, maybe we're less competitive. We actually import more than we export. Uh, National output, world trade, having a strong military. We've got a pretty strong military, I think, and strong financial centers, and then the strength of the currency. And I would say today that the US dollar is obviously still the world reserve currency, but you have to be careful. If you're not careful with that and you debase everybody, and somebody smarter, faster, more agile comes in and takes over, it could lead to some pretty crazy things. All right, I could go on and on for hours on this topic. I just picked this book because recently there was a one of the president's economists was asked the question, why does the U.S. or why does the U.S. take out debt if it can just print money? And he
Oh.
was totally baffled. He's like the chief economic advisor, and he could not explain as he was trying to like, yeah, why do we do that? And I thought,
Are you
you're in
kidding me?
charge. I'm not kidding. No, you can go look this up on Twitter. It was just, I just saw it this week and I was amazed. I'm like, you're the chief maybe I don't know what an economic advisor does, but I think his master's was in music and something else. And I'm
Oh,
thinking,
wow.
okay, that's not great. That's not great.
Yeah.
Um, you really, I think if most Americans understood how these things work, how the US dollar works, how the debt works, how money is printed, it would be very eye-opening for most people. So these cycles happen, they occur, they will continue to occur over time, and we just have to get back to those pillars of what makes a strong nation.
So
And I think in some areas,
what's
yeah,
your
go
main
ahead.
takeaway from this?
Okay, well,
I
here's the
mean, like
problem.
we always say,
Like
like, how do you
what can you do?
apply?
Yeah, how do you
You don't.
apply it?
I don't know if you
I know.
apply anything, but
I was expecting you to ask me this question because you do every time. How do I apply it? I
hmm
think the way that we apply it is we need to individually kind of reassess. I often think, and I know we don't talk about politics on this podcast, but
Mm-hmm.
there's clearly like the pendulum is swinging,
Mm-hmm.
to the right, and then it swings hard to the left, and it's like we're just playing this game of like one side will push it as hard as they can to the other side, and the
Mm-hmm.
other side pushes it back. And in my mind, I think that pendulum is going to just bust off that clock. So I'm kind of of the mind that we've got to slow that momentum of that pendulum down. And so in my own personal actions, I think the things that I can do is look for ways to be more thoughtful about the conversations that I have, to not battle. Certainly, I try to listen to people's thoughts and opinions on both sides. I think my diet of what I listen to and what I read and watch has really helped me. I've kind of like tuned out any of the major media channels, so I try to get away from agenda stuff and just read as much as I can.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my goal. I don't know
Okay.
personally. What do you think? Is that a reasonable approach or?
Well, I think that's all you can do. I mean, um, yeah, I don't know what else to. I just, I love that this was a marriage of what Matt likes, which is like exploration,
Totally.
ships, and then your financial stuff. That was great.
Well, you'd love the book. It's
I yeah,
rich in
it's
history.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's very. It sounds interesting. It's kind of like more the financial part of exploration and the spice trade and all that fun stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
it's like, how was Columbus funded?
yeah,
How
exactly.
do they fund any of these voyages? How do we fund anything?
Hmm.
How do we fund going to space? I mean, like you need money
Right.
to do it, and you need those strong capital centers, and you need a stable society to be. Otherwise, you're just warring all the time, and you can't. What is it? Maslow's hierarchy of
Yeah.
needs, where
Yep.
it's like, you need shelter, you need food,
Right.
and then you kind of
Uh,
ascend.
All the way to self-actualization. Um,
That's right.
all
That's
right.
right. Okay.
I have a book
Let's
called
hear. I want to hear
When
it.
Pride Still Mattered. Do you have any guess as to what this book's about?
When you first said it, I thought you said bride with a
Oh,
B,
Pride,
like Bravo.
When Pride Still Mattered.
Like my bride still matters. When pride,
Still
no, but it
mattered.
sounds interesting. I have not heard this, and usually you think of pride being a bad thing. So I'm really intrigued to hear when pride mattered. What's it about?
Still mattered. So this is basically a biography of Vince Lombardi. So Vince Lombardi, the
Oh, sure.
famous coach of the
Yeah.
Packers, Lombardi Trophy. That's the winner of the Super Bowl gets that trophy. Um, so basically, it's kind of talking about like that the thing is like, hey, he took pride in his work and worked hard to make sure the Packers were successful. All this, so that's kind of the gist of why it's titled like that, and taking pride in your work, things like that. So that's the title,
Ah,
but
okay.
it's just a biography of Vince Lombardi. So I think one of the issues I have, you and I both like biographies, but I don't know if I need to hear about somebody's great grandparents and parents and like
That's a speed.
it's a bit
That's a
too
two
much.
times listen.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
for
like
me it's
okay,
like, oh, his great
4x speed
grandpa,
that.
and I get that there's some reason because he's Italian American. His grandpa or something came over from Italy. Um and that's cool, but it's I always felt like they spend way too much time on it. But the gist of why it's important is, and obviously I didn't grow up in the 60s. Why it's important is that there was a lot of prejudice against Italian Americans. And so he experienced quite a bit of prejudice growing up. His wife that he eventually married, they didn't want him to marry an Italian American. The father-in-law didn't want him. So it's kind of cool because that comes up later, like his experience, kind of feeling some of that discrimination. Again, I was kind
Hmm.
of surprised because I guess I'd heard that a little bit, but I didn't really know much about it, right? Because you don't really hear about that right now. You heard a little bit about the Irish being discriminated against, the
Oh,
Italians
sure.
being
Oh,
discriminated,
yeah.
but like I
I'm of
did.
Italian descent,
Okay, so
so yeah.
I don't know that it's again. I'm not, so I just what I mean. Like you really only hear you don't hear about it as much, I guess. Anyway,
Yeah.
um, the reason I bring that up is that is actually really, it's kind of cool. He's kind of remembered for um, being not basically being anti-discrimination, right? And letting black players, white players, whoever was the best, right? He basically said, there's a quote, something like, there's no black or white players. There's only no black or white players. There's only Packer green players. Like, so it didn't matter if you were this or that, or, he didn't care. He didn't care about sexual orientation. I think he had an uncle that was homosexual. And so he was also a very faithful Catholic, and he actually was going to be a priest. So that was kind of interesting that he
Really?
he
Wow.
was it's like we have this guy who is probably one of the best football coaches ever, and he could have been just a priest that wasn't, nobody would have known, or I mean, I'm sure he could have made a difference in his life, but we wouldn't know who he was. Um, so they go through kind of his, where he plays. He's not quite big enough to make it in the professional leagues. He ultimately decides again to stop going to seminary and become a priest and to become a football coach. He coaches at Fordham, and then he becomes an assistant for the Giants, New York Giants, and oh, sorry, he goes to West Point as well. So he learns kind of
Oh,
the the military academy, and this is interesting because I obviously, unless you're a football nut, you don't know that Fordham used to be really good at football and West Point used to be really good at football. And they obviously have dropped off since. But it was interesting. They had they spent quite a bit of time on a West Point scandal of some of the football players just passing down tests, and like an academic scandal. And it's interesting because these guys were, they're military, and it's like, what if we let our military do? A lot of people got like, it's kind of sad in a way because it was kind of just common. That's just what they did. If you're a football player, you just get a test scores from somebody else, and so some people unfortunately got expelled. And anyway, just kind of he spends maybe almost too much time on that, but it was interesting. He goes over then at that point to the New York Giants, becomes an assistant coach, um, and then gets hired by the Packers in I think 1958, 59, something like that, and they were the worst of the worst at the time. They were like, I think they'd won one game, lost 10, tied one, or something like that. And they weren't even financially stable, that kind of thing. Ultimately, he kind of turns them around. I think he just, I, I, I don't even know if I can put my finger on what made him such a great coach. They do talk quite a bit about what's called the Packers sweep or the Lombardi sweep. So that's the play where they hand the ball off and the running back goes all the way around, as far almost to the sideline, and
mm,
they have a couple of people from the offensive line kind of pull to that side and block. And I guess he was like just very obsessed with his play and perfecting it. So that's the one thing that was kind of that I remember at least, is him being so precise and just being obsessed with like the perfection of like, no, you can't step with this foot out. It has to be at this angle to get the right step, to get the right speed, to get for the offensive lineman to pull out correctly. And
wow.
I think he played a little bit on the offensive line, but again, he was a little bit too small. And so he's just kind of obsessed. And he's, I don't know, that's probably what it was. He was also kind of known for being very fiery. One of the things that was really cool about this book is you think like, oh, Vince Lombardi, we're just going to hear what a great guy he is. But it was really cool that the biographer David Moranis talks quite a bit about how he neglected his family. He kind of had some, his wife kind of basically becomes an alcoholic because he's just never around. He's just constantly working, and just it was interesting how they didn't steer away from any flaws, like personal flaws that he had. Um, but again, they talk a little bit about what's called the Ice Bowl, which is a famous football game championship that was the Cowboys in Green Bay on New Year's Eve, and it was like negative 25 centigrade,
Oh,
so negative 13 Fahrenheit. And
that's cool.
they actually said like there's no way people should there's no way they're going to play this game. The Cowboys. Anyway, it's a crazy game. There's actually like documentaries about the specific game. When I went to Cammy's a Lions fan, and we went to Green Bay to watch the Lions play, and we went to the Packers Hall of Fame, and they had like a little setup where it shows like the stands. It's like a recreation of the stands during the Ice Bowl, And there's a few stories about how people were just drinking as much as they could. They were all the clothes they were wearing to try and stay warm. I think a couple people got frostbite and stuff like that. So
Wow.
it was
Dang.
interesting. And then eventually he goes to the Redskins, and he gets cancer and actually passes away fairly young. Um, and I think he was actually the coach of the Redskins when he passed away. But um, it's interesting. I think probably the things that stand out the most to me was just how for the time in the 60s, like there were teams that like didn't even have black players. I believe like there was a color barrier at least on like one or two teams, and he was just very much like I that's not for me, and like for example, uh I can't remember who it was that said this, but he said Vin was always fair about how he treated everybody, a great man who accepted people at face value for what they were and didn't judge anybody. He just wanted you to do the job. So he is very famous for a bunch of quotes. Some of those
Mm-hmm.
they falsely attribute to him. Um, like they came from a movie, but they say that he said them. And one of the things that was almost interesting, um, he almost interesting. This was interesting. I remember there was one game. There's just a couple things that stuck out to me. There was one game where they played poorly, and he started yelling at the players and saying that they didn't care, and he's the only one that cares about the team. He's just completely just ripping into him, and apparently, like the biggest guy, like some giant offensive lineman, is in the back, and he starts yelling like swearing, and he's known for never swearing, and he starts like running up like he's going to beat up the coach, and people
Wow.
like 4 or 5 people have to grab him and hold him back because he's so mad at being told that he doesn't care. um and anyway, it's so there's a couple cool stories like that, but basically he was very demanding, I think very precise, especially in that particular play, and very he just kind of wanted you to do your job. He didn't care anything about your background or whatever. And I think that was really cool considering considering the time, I guess. And
And that's a timeless principle. Like that
oh, for
should always
sure.
be the case, right?
But I think it was very abnormal. So like
Yeah.
there were teams, sorry, there were certain hotels that wouldn't allow black players to stay there. And so he was so they'd put like some black players in one hotel, white players in another. And he's like, no, we're not doing that. Unless you take the
Yeah.
whole
We're a
team,
team.
we're not
Yeah.
doing that. So
Good.
it was just kind of cool that he did that. And um again, there was actually a couple times that he talks about they're going into a kind of a dimly lit bar, and somebody told him, hey, the black people have to sit back here or something like that. And he's like, because he was Italian, so he was a little darker skin color, but it
Uh-huh.
was
Uh-huh.
dark, and so he was mistaken for it. So he kind of just had an idea of what it was like to be, have that prejudice against you. So it was just kind of cool. I really liked that part of it. Um, it was also kind of sad how he because he was still in the public eye, um, he you kind of see the cancer stuff take over and just how ill he is. But I remember there's a couple times where he would go speak at various places, and people would pay him. A lot of times he would donate that money to like local charities. And there was one guy who like he said, hey, Vince, come speak with me, and they're going to pay us this much. And he's like, okay, cool. And so he gets up there and he says, hey, he gives his little speech. And then he's like, and my buddy, and he's speaking, and he's like, and my money, the fee I'm getting for this is going to this charity. And he's like, and so is my buddy's. And his buddy's all mad at him because he wanted to keep the money. So it was just
Nice.
pretty funny. But yeah, I mean, this is the trophy that they carry around when you win the Super Bowl. It's the Lombardi Trophy. Again, very famous, famous guy, and just a cool history and cool story. I was really impressed that they didn't steer away from like his kind of failures at home. I think his son always felt like he was neglected. He was always trying to like do something to get his dad to pay attention. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so
That's
it's
tough.
this guy that is so famous in his profession, and then you kind of see the price he pays at home. So anyway, that's probably my takeaway is and not that that's me by any stretch, but like how important it is to have balance and try to accomplish your goals and stuff at work, but the people that are around you daily, they're so critical as well. You don't want to fail them. So
Well, to bring a Ray Dalio quote back into what you just said,
yeah,
he says you can have anything you want, but you can't have everything.
yeah, for
And
sure.
I try to remember that. Like if you want to be the best coach, you can do that, but you probably aren't going to have a normal, balanced family.
Yeah.
life. It's going to be tough. And that, I was also, it's interesting because you mentioned that, I mean, there are a lot of Vince Lombardi quotes. And now I'm wondering, one of my favorite quotes of his
Uh-huh.
is, the harder you work, the harder it is to surrender. But now I'm questioning if he actually did say
No,
that.
that's not the one that there's the famous one. Oh shoot, I can't remember what quote it is.
Is it the quitters, winners never quit and quitters never win? I think
Um, I don't know if that's it. Oh shoot,
maybe
I
that's when you've ascended, you're so famous that people just take any good quip or line and they attribute it to you,
there was it's a
even if you didn't say
oh
it. Like
man,
Albert Einstein, people do
I'm
that all
s-
the time. They're
I'm
like, "Oh
so
yeah, Albert Einstein said that." It's like, no, he didn't. There's no
exactly.
record of him ever saying that.
Give me 2 seconds and I'll find it. But I know this is good radio.
Yeah,
Um,
no, you're good.
um, yeah. Let's see. Anyway, one of them was basically like, no, this is actually from a movie, and he just liked the quote, so people just started saying it was him.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, I can't remember what it is, but um, he's got a ton of good quotes, and anyway, like one of them is like, defeat is worse than death because you have to live with defeat, things
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
What
anyway,
would you rate? What do you rate the book?
um, I would probably say it's maybe a triple. Again, I think there was a little bit too much time on like grandpa and you know, I mean, it's just a personal thing, right? Like I don't really care. I'm not reading the book to hear about Lombardi's grandpa.
Yeah.
And so I don't really need 2 chapters about it.
Right.
Um, and but I definitely loved how fair he was. Fair, I don't know if fair is the right word, but he didn't shy away from the issues at home and things like that. I thought that was cool. There's it's this is also one of the issues I had. It sounds a little bit weird, but he almost goes too quickly through like the seasons at Green Bay. Like, oh, and then they won the championship the next year. Like, oh, okay. Like
It's just random.
like we're gonna spend 2 chapters on the Ice Bowl because it's famous, but oh, this season they just won the championship, so good job. You know what I mean? Like, I kind of felt like there was a whole lot missing from the actual years he was at Green Bay. And I don't know. That was just my take. So anyway, I'll give it a triple. Again, if you
All
like
right.
football and the history of football, it's cool. But it's not like it's not something that I totally remember everything sticking with me, or you know what I mean. Like I don't remember
Yeah.
like a bunch of his quotes that they have in there that like I could just draw up at a moment's notice. So anyway, but he's if nothing else, go check out some Lombardi quotes. Whether or not he said them, they're attributed to him. They're probably good quotes. Um, anyway, I think with this and a couple of the military books that I've read, what's kind of stuck out to me, especially because this is not my strength, is how much they practice and go over the scenarios, and how much they like the military, how many contingency plans they have,
Yeah.
um, and how just the rehearsals that they go over. And me, as you can tell, I'm much more fly by the seat of my pants, especially on this podcast. And so there's just things that are, like for me that I realize, hey, if this is really important, I probably should practice it, go over it a little bit more, be a little more prepared. That's probably what I'd take away a little bit from it as well.
Well, and I think he said there's no such thing as a perfect game. There's only perfect practice, or perfect practice make perfect games,
Yeah.
which is true. You got to practice.
Yeah, and here's one. Winning is not a sometime thing. It's an all the time thing. You don't do things right once in a while. You do them right all the time. Just stuff like that, right? Like
Yeah.
he's just very driven, I guess is the right word. And
I actually have a football quote I wanted to run by you
okay,
as we kind of close things out here.
yeah, let's do it.
So I saw this on Instagram, speaking of social media and reading books, but it really hit me hard because it summarized a lot of the analogies that we make in sports. And it was this, it was to not focus on the touchdowns, focus on the first downs,
Hmm.
because a touchdown is just a first down. And the more you execute on your play, like you're talking about the Lombardi sweep, you're really executing on a first down, and enough successive first downs lead to the touchdowns. But if you're just thinking about the touchdowns, you make mistakes, you take undue risks. So just focus on the first down. Whatever's next in your life, whatever
Yeah.
thing you're working on, just focus on that next thing that you need to do, and the results will come.
Yeah. Every play, every day, right? That's
Ooh, I
what
like
I
that.
say.
I like that. Okay. I'm gonna
I
put that on
mean,
the Matt Liggett wall. You did say it.
I did. Well,
Every play,
that's
every
something I
day.
made up, and it's kind of corny, but it's like it's every
I love it.
every play, every day. Anyway,
Very
all
good.
right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. We appreciate it. Remember to like and subscribe. Thanks to Deja Vega for the music. Amazing band. Check them out. Give us some questions. Send it, tell us maybe a book we ought to read, and make some suggestions. Come on the podcast if you'd like, and pitch us a book. And we'll catch you next time on the Pitchbook podcast. Thanks.